Hi, it's Terry Ryder from Hotspotting, bringing you my regular weekly feature, The War on Misinformation. Now, up until very recently, real estate markets, housing markets around the country have been afflicted by media's tendency towards negative sensation, particularly the tendency amongst major media to take the downturn in Sydney and turn it into a national downturn crisis, which has never been the case. Now, with recent events and changes in sentiment, we now have media going a little bit sensationally crazy in the other direction. So, firstly, it's nice to see some positive articles being written about housing markets. It's been a while since we've heard anything much that's positive about prospects in residential real estate. But media being what it is, they're starting to go a little bit overboard with the positive stuff. What we never get from our media is balance, and that's what we'd all like to see. Well-informed, balanced coverage of what's going on in real estate markets around the country, and acknowledgement that we don't have a single market, that we have lots of different markets and different things are happening in different parts of the country. But we don't get that. What we get is a lot of commentary about Australia as one market, lots of conjecture and so-called factual reporting about what's happening with Australian house prices, as they like to call it. And we don't get anything that's in any way sophisticated, in-depth, meaningful about what's really going on in the different markets around the country. So in the wake of the recent positive events, we're now starting to get headlines like house prices making fast recovery in the wake of the election. So the election was 12 days ago, and according to some of the headlines we're seeing, prices are rising already. I mean, it's an absurd concept. We don't have sufficient time passed between the election result and the market absorbing the impact of that, and sales having time to take place and be settled for there to be anything meaningful to say about the impact on prices. We do expect overall the impact of recent events to be positive, but to declare in headlines and national media that we've already seen house prices rising because of the election is frankly ludicrous. The source of this nonsense, as usual, is Core Logic, who will, it seems, will do or say anything to generate a bit of publicity. And they're saying that their latest figures show that the housing market is making a speedy recovery since the federal election, which I remind you was 12 days ago. It's not happening. It may happen eventually. We do expect, as I say, positive outcomes, but to declare that it's already happening is frankly ludicrous. And they're treating their consumers, their readers, as fools if they expect them to believe this stuff. So let's just, and there's plenty of other stuff like that happening. Here's an article that says Macquarie believes Australian house prices will increase far sooner than many think. And it's an article in Business Insider Australia, which talks about Australia as a single market. That's the first clue. The first clue that the person that you're listening to or reading as an analyst or commentator is a pretender or a charlatan is if they talk about Australia as a single market and if they talk about Australian house prices as a single entity. It's a clue that they really aren't specialists and they don't know what they're talking about. So let's try and review what's happened and what's likely to happen as a consequence of it. We've had a series of positive events in a very short space of time. We've got the election out of the way. That was a major break on activity. We've got the re-election of the coalition and specifically the end of the negative spectre of Labor's negative gearing policy. So that's out of the way. And following soon on the heels of that, we had the announcement by APRA that it's re-electing some of its restrictions on the way banks are required to assess borrowers, no longer at the stress test buffer level of 7.25%, which is the one that most of the major banks apply. That's going to be reduced, so it will increase the borrowing capacity of people looking for mortgages and make it easier for them to get loans. We've also got the prospects of an official interest rate cut next week at the Reserve Bank's monthly board meeting, and a lot of analysts are predicting 2 or 3 official interest rate reductions by the Reserve Bank in the next 6 months or so. That, if it starts to happen, will certainly be helpful. That will be happening in a climate where the major lenders are already competing quite strongly for the business of investors again, so that's all very positive as well. And we also have the policy of the re-elected coalition government with their scheme to help first-home buyers able to get loans with deposits of only 5%. So what does all this mean? A lot of changes, a lot of positive events for the housing markets in a very short space of time, just in the last week or 10 days. What it means, firstly, there's obviously been an uplift in sentiment, and that's been reflected in the media reaction. A lot of people who were fence sitting, waiting to see the outcome of the election before making major decisions, they'll get off the fence, and some of them at least, and start actually making decisions and getting out there both as buyers and sellers. We're going to see more activity in the markets. We're particularly going to see first home buyers busy because there's that scheme by the re-elected federal government to assist first home buyers. There's also the APRA changes and the potential for interest rate cuts. All of that increases the borrowing capacity of first home buyers. So we're going to see an impact, I think, in particular in the smaller, cheaper capital cities, and in the more affordable suburbs of our major cities. And we're also going to see first-home buyers and others focusing on regional areas close to the major cities. Now, to a certain degree, all of that's already happening, particularly the heightened activity and prices rising in regional areas, regional Victoria, regional Tasmania, regional New South Wales in particular. So that's going to be enhanced by the events of the last 1 to 2 weeks. And it's all looking a whole lot more positive. There's more optimism out there than there was the case a couple of weeks ago. And professionals in the real estate industry are reporting that there's been a noticeable change in sentiment, inquiry, activity, even in the short time since the federal election was decided. Too soon for it to translate into meaningful trends and prices, notwithstanding the headlines that we've seen in major media quoting CoreLogic claiming that prices are already rising as a result of the election. Just really silly stuff. But I do expect that to happen. But there will be different scenarios in different parts of Australia, as is always the case. And that's what we're not getting from mainstream media. We're not getting that recognition that there is more than one market in Australia, and there's lots of different scenarios playing out across the country. That's going to continue. The overall situation is a whole lot more positive than media has generally led us to believe so far this year. In Brisbane, for example, media and analysts who tend to use one figure to describe an entire city market has been telling us that Brisbane prices have risen only 1%, or another source will say they're down 1% in annual terms. If you do it suburb by suburb, but more an in-depth analysis like the one that we do, you'll find that 70% of Australia, Brisbane suburbs, have median prices higher than 12 months ago. It's 74% of suburbs in Adelaide that have rising prices. Even in Perth, which is always described by media and analysts as a market that's still falling, in actual fact, 40% of Perth suburbs have median prices higher than 12 months ago. And there's all sorts of other evidence that that market has moved into a recovery phase. So the positive events of the last 1 to 2 weeks, the election, the APRA announcement, the potential for interest rate reductions, the first home buyer assistance scheme by the federal government, it's all going to feed into markets in various different ways around the country, and we're going to see some more positive outcomes as we move forward. But don't get too carried away by the sensationalist headlines you're reading in media. Until recently it was sensationally negative. Now it's going overboard in the other direction, and it's being just a little bit too sensationally positive to be realistic. That's it for now. Terry Ryder from hotspotting.com.au signing off. Let's do it again soon.